The morning sun cast long shadows across the cornfield as I stood on the porch, clutching my husband Earl's old leather journal. 3 weeks had passed since we laid him to rest next to the oak tree he planted 40 years ago. The farm stretched before me like a living testament to our life together, every acre carved from nothing but sweat and stubborn determination. But Marcus, my daughter Sarah's husband, had been circling like a vulture ever since the funeral. Just yesterday, he'd cornered me in the kitchen with talk of selling, of moving me into some retirement community where I could be properly cared for. His words still burned in my chest. What Marcus didn't understand was that this farm held secrets deeper than the roots of our century-old apple trees. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what state you're from, because this story reaches every corner of America where families fight over what really matters most. Something told me that Earl's final wishes were about to be tested in ways I couldn't imagine. Marcus arrived at 7:30 sharp, his expensive sedan crunching gravel as he parked next to Earl's old pickup truck. Through the kitchen window, I watched him straighten his tie and check his phone before striding toward the house with that confident swagger that had always rubbed me wrong. Sarah followed behind, her face tight with worry. She'd been caught between us for weeks now, torn between loyalty to her husband and love for the woman who raised her. The screen door squeaked as they entered, and Marcus immediately began surveying the room like he was already calculating square footage for renovations. He carried a manila folder thick with documents, and something about his eager expression made my stomach churn. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing between us, and I remembered how Earl used to say those tiny specks were just dreams looking for a place to land. Today felt like some dreams were about to be crushed underfoot, but whose dreams would survive remained to be seen. Sarah hugged me first, her embrace lasting longer than usual, as if she were apologizing in advance. "Mom, we need to talk about your situation here," she said softly, her voice carrying the careful tone she'd learned from her counseling classes. Marcus set his folder on the kitchen table with a decisive thunk, and I noticed how he avoided making eye contact with me directly. Instead, he focused on the worn linoleum, the outdated appliances, the peeling wallpaper that Earl and I had hung together during our second winter here. "Margaret, I've done some research," Marcus began, pulling out a stack of papers, "and the property taxes alone are going to eat you alive, plus the maintenance costs, the insurance increases, the agricultural exemption paperwork." He spread the documents across the table like a poker player, revealing a winning hand, each page dense with numbers that seemed designed to overwhelm rather than inform. But I'd been managing this farm's finances longer than he'd been alive, and his condescending tone only strengthened my resolve to dig deeper into Earl's secrets. What Marcus didn't know was that my husband had been preparing for someone exactly like him. The smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the air from my morning routine, but the kitchen felt different with Marcus's presence filling it like smoke. He pointed to a highlighted section on one of his documents, explaining how selling now would net me enough money to live comfortably in assisted living for the rest of my life. "Think about it, Margaret," he pressed, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. "No more worrying about broken fence posts or failed crops or equipment maintenance. You could spend your golden years relaxing, maybe taking up painting or joining a book club." Sarah nodded along, but I caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes when she glanced at the window overlooking the garden where she'd learned to walk among the tomato plants. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus was trying to sell me on, abandoning the very land that had taught my daughter the value of hard work and perseverance. Earl's journal felt heavy in my apron pocket, its leather cover warmed by my body heat and weighted with promises I'd made to my late husband about protecting what we'd built together. The pressure in his voice suggested that time was running out for something, but I wasn't sure what. "I appreciate your concern," I said finally, pouring myself another cup of coffee to buy thinking time. "But this farm isn't just property to me. It's 43 years of memories, of seasons lived and lessons learned." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, and I recognized the expression he wore when someone challenged his expertise in real estate development. He pulled out another document, this one bearing an official seal that caught the morning light. "I've already had the property appraised," he announced, sliding the paper toward me like a chess move. $750,000, Margaret. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime." The number hung in the air between us, substantial and tempting, but I thought about Earl's final words about things hidden in plain sight. My husband had been a careful man, methodical in ways that others often missed. If he'd insisted on keeping the original deed in that old strongbox instead of the safety deposit box where we kept everything else, there had to be a reason worth discovering. The appraisal might tell Marcus what the farm was worth on the surface, but it couldn't measure what lay beneath or what it truly meant to our family. Sarah reached across the table and covered my weathered hand with hers, her wedding ring catching the light as she spoke. "Mom, we're worried about you here alone. Yesterday when I called, you didn't answer for hours, and I kept imagining you'd fallen or had an emergency with no one around to help." Her concern was genuine, born from love rather than greed, which made Marcus's manipulation of her fears even more troubling. I could see how he'd worked on her, planting seeds of worry that had grown into this intervention disguised as family concern. The truth was, I'd been in the south pasture yesterday, checking on the pregnant mare who'd been showing signs of distress. I'd delivered 3 foals in my lifetime and wasn't about to let Buttercup struggle alone just because some city boy thought rural life was too dangerous for a 72-year-old woman. But explaining that to Sarah would only fuel Marcus's arguments about my supposed inability to handle the farm's demands. Instead, I squeezed her hand and tried to project the confidence that Earl had always admired in me, wondering what other fears Marcus had been feeding her behind my back. Marcus sensed an opening in Sarah's emotional appeal and pressed forward with renewed intensity. "The market is hot right now, Margaret, but that won't last forever. Interest rates are climbing, and development opportunities like this one don't come around often." He gestured toward the window where my prize-winning rose bushes bloomed against the white picket fence. "A developer has already expressed interest in turning this into a subdivision. Maple Grove Estates, they're calling it. Imagine young families building their dreams where your memories live." The manipulation was smooth, almost poetic, but I heard the underlying message clearly. Sell now or watch the value decline while I struggled alone on land too big for an aging widow. What Marcus didn't know was that Earl and I had weathered 3 major recessions, 2 droughts, and a flood that had wiped out half our crops in '94. We'd learned to read markets and weather patterns with equal skill, and I could smell desperation beneath Marcus's confident presentation. Something about his urgency suggested this deal meant more to him than he was admitting, but I couldn't figure out what that something might be. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 o'clock, its familiar sound grounding me in the rhythm of life that had sustained this farm for decades. Earl had wound that clock every Sunday morning after church, and I'd continued the tradition, even though the silence sometimes felt overwhelming. "Marcus," I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate calm, "I need time to think about this. Decisions this big shouldn't be rushed, no matter what the market conditions might be." His face flushed slightly, and I caught a glimpse of the temper he usually kept hidden behind his professional facade. Sarah looked relieved at my reasonable response, probably hoping this meant I was considering his proposal seriously. But I was actually buying time to examine the deed Earl had mentioned in his journal, the one he'd called our insurance policy against smooth-talking outsiders. The phrase had seemed like confused rambling during his final illness, but Marcus's pressure tactics were giving new meaning to my husband's cryptic warnings. The morning sun climbed higher, and I realized this confrontation was just beginning, with stakes I didn't yet understand. After Marcus and Sarah left, promising to return tomorrow for my answer, I climbed the stairs to the bedroom Earl and I had shared for 4 decades. The floorboards creaked under my feet in a pattern as familiar as my own heartbeat, each sound a note in the symphony of home. His presence still lingered in the room, from the aftershave bottle on the dresser to the biography of Teddy Roosevelt bookmarked halfway through on his nightstand. But it was the old strong box under our bed that called to me now, its brass corners tarnished with age and memories. Earl had insisted on keeping important documents there instead of the bank, claiming that what mattered most should stay close to home where you could protect it personally. I'd always thought he was being overly cautious, but as I lifted the heavy box onto the quilted bedspread my grandmother had made, I wondered what wisdom my husband had possessed that I'd been too practical to appreciate. The key hung on a chain around my neck, the metal worn smooth by years of absent-minded fidgeting during particularly stressful moments like tax season or drought years. Whatever Earl had hidden from Marcus's prying eyes was about to be revealed. The strongbox opened with a satisfying click, revealing the organized chaos of our life together. Birth certificates, marriage license, insurance policies, and vaccination records for every animal we'd ever owned filled manila folders arranged in Earl's precise system. But at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, lay the original deed to our property, dated March 15th, 1981. The paper felt substantial in my hands, heavier than modern documents with their crisp white surfaces and computer printing. This deed had been handwritten in fountain pen ink that had faded to sepia, every letter formed with the careful precision of someone who understood that words on paper could determine a family's future for generations. As I untied the string, my fingers trembled slightly with anticipation and the weight of Earl's journal in my lap. His final entries had been increasingly cryptic, filled with references to mineral surveys and subsurface rights that I'd attributed to the pain medication clouding his thoughts. But now, holding the deed that represented everything we'd built together, I began to suspect my husband had been more lucid than anyone realized. The document seemed to pulse with secrets waiting to be discovered. The first thing I noticed about the deed was how much thicker it was than I remembered. What I'd assumed was a single document turned out to be multiple pages, each one densely packed with legal language that made my head spin. Earl had been the one who handled all the paperwork when we bought the farm, translating the lawyer's explanations into plain English for my benefit. But now, reading alone by the afternoon light streaming through our bedroom window, I struggled to understand phrases like hereditaments and appurtenances and subsurface mineral extraction rights retained in perpetuity. The third page, however, contained a hand-drawn map that looked nothing like our current property boundaries. According to this survey, our farm included not just the 120 acres we'd always known about, but an additional 80-acre parcel extending into what I'd believed was state forest land. More intriguingly, someone had marked several spots on the map with tiny X's and the notation "Test Sites Surveyed August 1979. Earl had never mentioned any geological surveys, and we'd bought the property 2 years after the date on the map. The mystery was deepening with every page I turned. My heart began racing as I turned to the final page of the deed, where a separate addendum detailed something called subsurface rights and mineral extraction privileges. The language was formal and intimidating, but the basic meaning became clear as I read it twice. Whoever owned this property also owned everything beneath it, including any oil, gas, or mineral deposits that might be discovered. Furthermore, the previous owner had commissioned a geological survey in 1979 that identified significant limestone deposits suitable for commercial quarrying operations and preliminary indicators of natural gas reserves requiring additional exploration. The document was signed by a geologist from the State University and notarized by someone whose signature had faded beyond recognition. Earl had never mentioned any of this during our 43 years on the farm, but I remembered now how he'd sometimes walked the back property line with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to checking fence posts. He'd also maintained a correspondence with someone at the geology department that I'd assumed was related to his interest in soil conservation. Suddenly, Marcus's eagerness to purchase the farm took on an entirely different meaning, one that made my hands shake as I realized what might have been at stake. The phone rang downstairs, jolting me from my discoveries and sending the deed papers fluttering to the floor. Sarah's voice carried up from the kitchen where I'd left the cordless phone, her tone urgent enough to make me hurry down the stairs, despite my 72-year-old knees protesting the pace. "Mom, are you there? Marcus is really worried about leaving you alone overnight, and he thinks we should come back this evening to continue our discussion." The timing felt suspicious, as if he'd somehow sensed that I was uncovering information that could complicate his plans. I gathered the scattered deed pages while balancing the phone against my shoulder, trying to keep my voice steady as I assured Sarah that I was fine and looking forward to seeing them tomorrow as planned. But after I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's sudden urgency meant he knew more about this property than he'd revealed. Earl's journal had mentioned something about folks sniffing around the mineral rights during the months before his passing, and I wondered if my son-in-law's interest in helping me sell was connected to information he'd somehow obtained through his real estate connections. The pieces of this puzzle were starting to fit together in ways that made me question everything Marcus had told us. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Earl's journal open beside the deed, trying to piece together the puzzle my husband had left behind. His entries from the past year revealed a completely different picture of our supposedly struggling farm. According to his notes, he'd been contacted 3 times by representatives from something called Midwest Energy Exploration, a company interested in leasing mineral rights for natural gas extraction. Earl had politely declined each approach, noting in his journal that the family farm isn't for sale to the highest bidder, especially not to folks who'd turn our pasture into an industrial site. More troubling were his observations about Marcus, whom Earl described as asking too many questions about property taxes, land values, and our plans for the future. "That boy's got dollar signs in his eyes every time he looks at our acres," Earl had written just 6 weeks before his passing. "Need to make sure Margaret knows about the deed provisions before something happens to me." The final entry, dated just 3 days before Earl's heart attack, contained a single chilling sentence. "Someone's been walking our back boundary line at night, and it ain't deer season." The implications were becoming clearer, and none of them painted Marcus in a favorable light. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who would change everything about my understanding of the situation. Dorothy Chen from the county assessor's office knocked on my door at 9:15, carrying a clipboard and wearing the apologetic expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry to bother you during your bereavement, but we've received some inquiries about your property that require clarification." She explained that someone had requested updated surveys and mineral rights documentation for our farm, claiming to represent my interests in a potential sale. The timing was too coincidental to ignore, and when Dorothy showed me the request form, I wasn't surprised to see Marcus's business letterhead at the top. He'd been conducting his own investigation into our property, probably hoping to find information that would support his arguments about selling. But his research had inadvertently triggered a county review that was about to reveal just how valuable our farm really was. Dorothy opened her folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents that made Earl's deed look simple by comparison. "Mrs. Henderson, I have to tell you, your property is one of the most interesting cases I've seen in 20 years with the county," she said, settling into the kitchen chair Marcus had occupied yesterday. Dorothy's professional composure couldn't hide her obvious excitement about the geological reports spread across my table. According to the county's records, our farm sat on top of what geologists called the Maple Ridge Formation, a limestone deposit that could potentially yield both high-quality quarrying stone and significant natural gas reserves. The original property surveys from 1878 had noted unusual rock formations and bubbling springs that were now recognized as indicators of subsurface energy deposits. More importantly, the mineral rights had never been separated from the surface ownership, meaning that whoever owned our farm also owned everything beneath it, down to the center of the earth. Dorothy's finger traced the boundary lines on her map, showing me how our property connected to 3 other farms where energy companies had recently begun preliminary exploration. "Mrs. Henderson," she said quietly, "depending on what's down there, your mineral rights alone could be worth more than the entire surface value of the farm." The words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything I thought I knew about our financial situation. Marcus's pressure to sell quickly was beginning to make perfect sense, but not in the way he'd presented it to me and Sarah. The implications of Dorothy's information hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Marcus wasn't just interested in helping me sell the farm to secure my future comfort. He was positioning himself to acquire property that could potentially be worth millions of dollars in mineral rights. The energy company representatives Earl had mentioned in his journal weren't random speculators, but part of a coordinated effort to secure drilling rights across the entire Maple Ridge Formation. By pressuring me to sell quickly, before I had time to research the property's true value, Marcus was essentially trying to manipulate me into giving up my family's legacy and transform it into his personal windfall. Sarah probably had no idea about her husband's true motivations, which meant she was being deceived just as systematically as I was. Dorothy gathered her papers with the careful precision of someone who understood she'd just delivered information that could destroy a family or save a farm, depending on what happened next. Mrs. Henderson, I'd strongly recommend getting an independent geological survey before making any decisions about this property. Her advice was sound, but I suspected that Marcus wasn't going to give me the time necessary to follow through on such a comprehensive investigation. After Dorothy left, I called my sister Helen in Florida, the only person I trusted to help me think through this impossible situation without judgment or agenda. Helen had always been the practical one in our family, the sister who'd moved to the city and learned to navigate complex business deals through her career in banking. "Margaret, you listen to me," she said, after I'd explained everything Dorothy had revealed. "That son-in-law of yours is trying to pull a fast one, and Sarah's too trusting to see it coming." Helen's voice carried the stern authority that had made her successful in a male-dominated profession and the fierce protectiveness that had always made her my champion when we were children. She promised to drive up from Tampa immediately, bringing her financial advisor and a lawyer who specialized in mineral rights cases. "Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't let Marcus know what you've discovered until we can figure out how to protect you and Sarah both," she warned. The farm that had seemed like a burden yesterday morning was now revealed as a treasure that unscrupulous people were trying to take from under my nose. Helen's arrival couldn't come soon enough, because I had a feeling that Marcus wasn't going to wait patiently for my decision much longer. That afternoon, I walked the back property line that Earl had mentioned in his journal, following the faint trail that led through the woods toward what I'd always believed was state land. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the leaves crunched under my feet in a rhythm that reminded me of Earl's steady footsteps beside me during our evening walks. But today, I was walking alone and looking for signs of the nighttime visitors he'd mentioned in his final journal entry. About half a mile from the house, I found evidence that someone had indeed been surveying our property without permission. Fresh stakes had been driven into the ground at regular intervals, each one marked with fluorescent orange tape and GPS coordinates written in waterproof ink. The stakes formed a grid pattern that extended well beyond what I'd thought were our boundaries, confirming Dorothy's information about the additional 80 acres Earl had quietly acquired over the years. More disturbing were the tire tracks from heavy equipment that had clearly been brought in recently, probably within the past few weeks while I'd been focused on Earl's illness and funeral arrangements. Someone had been conducting unauthorized surveys on my land, and I had a growing suspicion about who had provided them with access or at least knowledge about the property's potential. The sound of a car engine interrupted my investigation, and I hurried back toward the house to find Marcus's sedan pulling into the driveway earlier than expected. Sarah got out first, her face flushed with what looked like embarrassment or anger, and she avoided making eye contact as I approached. Marcus emerged from the driver's seat with his usual confident stride, but something about his posture seemed more aggressive than yesterday, as if he'd decided to abandon subtle persuasion in favor of direct confrontation. "Margaret, we need to talk," he announced without preamble, gesturing toward the manila folder in his hand. "I've done some additional research, and your situation is more precarious than we initially discussed." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me, but I kept my expression neutral while my mind raced through strategies for protecting both myself and Sarah from whatever manipulation he was planning. The survey stakes hidden in my jacket pocket felt like evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet, but I sensed that Marcus was about to force the issue whether I was ready or not. His urgency suggested that someone else was putting pressure on him to close this deal quickly. "I've been in contact with Midwest Energy Exploration," Marcus said without invitation, settling himself at my kitchen table as if he owned it already. "They've made a very generous offer for your mineral rights, Margaret, but only if we act quickly." He spread new documents across the surface, these ones bearing corporate logos and official seals that were designed to intimidate rather than inform. According to his paperwork, the energy company was offering a $200,000 bonus for signing a 10-year drilling lease, plus royalty payments of 12% on any gas or oil extracted from the property. "This is found money, Margaret," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the practiced enthusiasm of a salesman closing a deal. You could take the lease bonus and the sale proceeds from the farm and set yourself up for life. Sarah sat quietly beside him, her discomfort obvious in the way she fidgeted with her wedding ring and avoided looking directly at me. I realized that Marcus had probably presented this information to her as evidence that he was looking out for my best interests, when in reality, he was orchestrating the manipulation of my family's legacy through legal maneuvers, too complex for most people to understand. The energy company's offer was impressive on its surface, but I'd learned enough from Dorothy and Earl's journal to recognize it as potentially a fraction of what the mineral rights might actually be worth. The pressure Marcus was applying felt different this morning, more desperate and less patient than his previous attempts at persuasion. "Margaret, I appreciate you researching all of this," I said carefully. "But Dorothy from the county assessor's office was here yesterday, and she mentioned that mineral rights in this area could be worth considerably more than what this company is offering." His face went pale, and I saw genuine panic flash across his features before he regained his composure. Sarah looked confused, as if she was hearing about Dorothy's visit for the first time, which confirmed my suspicion that Marcus had been keeping information from her just as systematically as he'd been pressuring me. The kitchen felt smaller with the tension building between us, and I could hear the old refrigerator humming in the silence as Marcus processed the fact that I'd discovered information he'd hoped to keep hidden. His next words would reveal whether he planned to continue the charade of family concern or abandon pretense entirely in favor of direct manipulation. The mask was finally starting to slip, and I could see the calculation behind his supposed generosity. "County assessors don't know anything about market realities," Marcus said dismissively, but his voice lacked the confidence he'd displayed earlier. "They deal with property taxes, not energy exploration. This offer from Midwest Energy is based on actual geological surveys and real market conditions." He pulled out another document, this one showing a map of the surrounding area with various drilling sites marked in red. According to his presentation, 3 neighboring farms had already signed similar leases, creating a pattern of development that would make my property more valuable if I participated or potentially worthless if I held out as the lone holdout. The logic was seductive, and I could see how someone less informed might feel pressured to sign immediately rather than risk being left behind. But I also noticed that Marcus's map didn't show the additional 80 acres that Dorothy had confirmed were part of my property, which meant either his research was incomplete or he was deliberately understating the value of what he was asking me to sell. Either way, his credibility was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it with increasingly desperate arguments. Sarah was beginning to notice the inconsistencies too, and I could see her studying her husband's face with growing suspicion. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice quiet but determined in the way that reminded me of her teenage years when she'd challenge authority figures who treated her unfairly. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." She turned to face Marcus with an expression I'd never seen before, one that suggested she was beginning to question more than just this particular conversation. "Did you know about the mineral rights before Dad passed? Is that why you've been so insistent about Mom selling the farm?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the grandfather clock marking another quarter hour in what was rapidly becoming the most important day in our family's recent history. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions, from surprise to calculation to something that looked like guilty resignation. I realized that Sarah had been putting pieces together on her own, probably noticing inconsistencies in his explanations or discovering evidence of his research that he'd thought she wouldn't understand. The daughter I'd raised to value honesty and fairness was finally seeing her husband clearly, and the revelation was obviously breaking her heart even as it opened her eyes. The moment of truth was arriving, and Marcus would have to decide whether to continue his deception or finally reveal his true motivations. "Sarah, you don't understand how complex these situations can be," Marcus said, reaching for her hand across the table. "I've been trying to protect both of you from making a mistake that could cost you everything." But his explanation sounded hollow, even to my ears, and Sarah pulled her hand away from his with a sharpness that made me proud and sad simultaneously. She was 28 years old, and discovering that the man she'd trusted with her future had been manipulating her mother and deceiving her about his motivations. The energy company documents spread across my kitchen table represented more than just a business opportunity. They were evidence of betrayal at the most fundamental level of family trust. I wanted to comfort Sarah, but I also knew she needed to process this revelation on her own terms. My role was to protect our family's interests while giving her space to make her own decisions about her marriage and her future. The farm that Earl and I had built through decades of hard work was becoming the catalyst for choices that would define the next generation of our family. Whatever happened next, Sarah would need to know that she had my support regardless of what she decided about her relationship with Marcus. The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but Helen's arrival at 5:30 that evening brought reinforcements I desperately needed. My sister emerged from her rental car like a force of nature, followed by two professional-looking people who introduced themselves as Janet Morrison, financial advisor, and Robert Kim, attorney specializing in mineral rights law. Helen took one look at the tension in my kitchen and immediately understood that we'd reached a crisis point that would require all of her considerable expertise to resolve. "Margaret, I think we need to have a family meeting," she announced, settling herself at the table with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. Marcus looked distinctly uncomfortable with these new arrivals, probably because he recognized that his window of opportunity for pressuring me into hasty decisions was rapidly closing. Sarah seemed relieved to have additional adults present who might help her navigate the increasingly complex emotional and financial landscape that her marriage had become. The farm kitchen that had hosted countless family dinners and celebrations was about to become the site of a reckoning that would determine everyone's future. The stakes were higher than any of us had imagined when this confrontation began. Robert Kim spread his own documents across the table, these ones bearing the letterhead of his law firm and the seal of the State Mineral Rights Commission. "Mrs. Henderson, after reviewing the information Helen provided, I need to tell you that your property is potentially worth far more than anyone has suggested." His preliminary research had uncovered drilling activity on neighboring farms that was generating royalty payments in excess of $50,000 per month for properties smaller than mine. The energy company that Marcus had presented as offering generous terms was actually known in industry circles for acquiring mineral rights at below-market rates from uninformed property owners. More importantly, the geological surveys Earl had mentioned in his journal were part of a comprehensive study that had identified our farm as sitting on what might be the richest natural gas deposit in the county. "Mrs. Henderson, if these preliminary indicators are accurate, your mineral rights alone could be worth between $5 and $10 million over the next 20 years. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming everything I thought I knew about our family's financial situation and our future possibilities. Marcus's face went from pale to ashen as Robert's information sank in, and I could see him calculating how much money his pressure tactics had potentially cost him. The true value of what he'd been trying to acquire was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Marcus's face reflected the dawning realization that his manipulation had been exposed in the most devastating way possible. "That's speculative," he said weakly, "based on geological surveys that might not reflect actual extraction possibilities." But Janet Morrison had brought her own research, including recent sales of comparable mineral rights in the area and production reports from existing wells that supported Robert's valuation estimates. According to her analysis, mineral rights in our area were selling for between $15,000 and $20,000 per acre, meaning that even the original 120 acres I'd known about could generate over $2 million in immediate sale value, with ongoing royalty potential that far exceeded that initial payment. The additional 80 acres that Dorothy had identified would potentially double those figures, creating a legacy that could support not just my retirement, but Sarah's future and her children's education. "Mrs. Henderson," Janet said gently, "you're not a struggling widow who needs to sell the farm to survive. You're potentially one of the wealthiest landowners in the county, and you have options that most people could never imagine." The revelation was stunning, but what struck me most was the look of horror spreading across Sarah's face as she fully understood what her husband had been trying to accomplish through his supposed concern for my welfare. The revelation of our true financial situation created a moment of stunned silence that allowed everyone to process how dramatically the conversation had shifted. Sarah stared at her husband with growing horror as she realized the magnitude of what he'd been trying to manipulate her into supporting. "Marcus, you knew," she said quietly, her voice carrying more sadness than anger. "You knew about the mineral rights, and you were trying to trick Mom into selling for a fraction of what it's worth." He started to protest, but Helen cut him off with the kind of authoritative intervention that had made her successful in high-stakes business negotiations. "Young man, we're way past the point where explanations are going to help you. The question now is what you're going to do to make this right." The farm kitchen felt charged with the tension of a family reckoning that had been building for months, with Earl's passing simply providing the catalyst for revealing Marcus's true character. I looked at my daughter's face and saw the moment when she understood that her husband had been willing to impoverish her own mother for personal gain. The betrayal was complete, and there would be no going back to the way things had been before this moment of truth. Sarah's choice was clear: stand with her family or continue enabling her husband's deception. That evening, after Marcus had left alone and Sarah had chosen to stay with me, we sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the cornfield that had suddenly become our family's ticket to financial security. The familiar sounds of evening on the farm seemed different now that I knew the land beneath our feet held treasures Earl had spent years protecting from people exactly like Marcus. Sarah hadn't said much since her husband's departure, but I could see her processing the day's revelations in the careful, methodical way she'd inherited from her father. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she finally whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of apology and realization. "I thought he was looking out for both of us. I never imagined he could be so calculating." I reached over and took her hand, feeling the wedding ring that now represented betrayal rather than commitment. The conversation we needed to have about her future would be difficult, but it could wait until she'd had time to grieve the loss of illusions that had shaped her adult life. The evening breeze carried the scent of autumn across the fields Earl had loved, and I realized that his spirit was somehow still protecting us from those who would harm what we'd built together. Marcus's deception had been exposed, but the healing process was just beginning. Helen and her advisors spent the next morning creating a comprehensive plan for managing the mineral rights discovery in a way that would maximize both immediate security and long-term wealth building. Robert Kim arranged for an independent geological survey that would provide definitive information about the natural gas deposits beneath our farm, while Janet Morrison structured a family trust that would protect the assets from any future legal challenges Marcus might attempt. The complexity of managing sudden wealth was overwhelming, but Helen's experience in banking helped translate the technical details into decisions I could understand and feel confident about. According to their projections, even the most conservative development of our mineral rights would generate enough income to allow me to stay on the farm while also setting up educational funds for future grandchildren and charitable giving that could benefit the entire community. Earl's dream of keeping the family farm in family hands was not only possible but guaranteed for generations to come. The man who'd worked so hard to protect what we'd built together had unknowingly left me with the resources to honor his memory in ways he'd never imagined. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's greed had ultimately led to the discovery of wealth that would ensure our family's security forever. The independent geological survey arrived 3 weeks later, confirming Robert's initial estimates and adding details that exceeded our most optimistic projections. The Maple Ridge Formation beneath our property contained not just natural gas, but also high-quality limestone deposits that could support quarrying operations for decades to come. More intriguingly, the survey identified rare earth minerals that were increasingly valuable for electronics manufacturing, creating multiple revenue streams that could operate simultaneously without interfering with each other. The total estimated value of subsurface rights was now projected at between $12 and $15 million over a 20-year extraction period, with additional long-term potential that could extend well into the 22nd century. Earl's journal had mentioned his grandfather's stories about treasure buried on Henderson land, and I wondered if the old man had somehow sensed that the earth held riches his descendants would eventually discover. The farm that Marcus had dismissed as a burden was revealed as a legacy that could change our family's circumstances for generations while honoring Earl's commitment to stewardship and sustainability. Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be discovered by those who care enough to look beyond the surface. Sarah's divorce proceedings began in December, with Marcus finally agreeing to a settlement that required him to surrender any potential claim to the farm or its mineral rights. The process was emotionally difficult for Sarah, but she approached it with the same steady determination that had carried her through college and graduate school, despite financial challenges. Helen stayed through the holidays, helping both of us navigate the legal complexities while also planning sustainable development of the mineral rights that would balance income generation with environmental protection. We established the Earl Henderson Family Trust, with Sarah as the primary beneficiary and specific provisions for maintaining the farm's agricultural character while allowing limited resource extraction under strict environmental guidelines. The energy company that had tried to pressure us through Marcus's manipulation now found themselves negotiating with experienced legal representation and paying market rates for access to what industry experts were calling one of the most promising natural gas fields in the region. Earl would have been proud to see his careful planning and protection of our land rights vindicated in such spectacular fashion. The legacy he'd left was about to transform not just our family's future, but the entire community's economic landscape. By spring, the first drilling equipment arrived on the back 40 acres, operating under environmental protocols that allowed us to maintain the farm's traditional operations while generating monthly royalty checks that exceeded what Earl and I had earned in our best agricultural years. Sarah moved into the farmhouse with me, bringing her counseling practice to the nearby town and discovering that rural life suited her better than the suburban development where she'd lived with Marcus. We hired local contractors to update the house and outbuildings while preserving the character that made this place home, and established a scholarship fund at the county high school for students planning careers in agriculture or environmental science. The energy company's operations were so well managed that visitors couldn't tell development was occurring unless they knew where to look, and the additional income allowed us to purchase conservation easements on neighboring farms to ensure that the rural character of the area would be preserved for future generations. Dorothy from the county assessor's office became a regular visitor, helping us navigate property tax implications and connecting us with other landowners who were facing similar mineral rights decisions. The transformation was remarkable, but it felt like a natural evolution of Earl's vision rather than a dramatic departure from our family's values. The transformation of our circumstances attracted attention from regional media, and I found myself telling our story to reporters who were fascinated by the combination of family drama and unexpected wealth. The interviews always focused on how a widow facing financial hardship had discovered that her farm held millions of dollars in mineral rights. But I tried to steer the conversation toward Earl's wisdom in protecting our land rights and the importance of understanding property ownership, details that most people take for granted. Sarah worried that the publicity might attract unwanted attention from people hoping to take advantage of our newfound wealth, but Helen's legal team had structured our trust in ways that protected our privacy while ensuring transparent management of the assets. The story resonated with rural audiences who understood how easy it was for outside interests to exploit family crises and pressure landowners into disadvantageous deals. Several other widows contacted me after seeing the interviews, sharing their own stories of relatives who'd tried to pressure them into selling valuable properties for below-market prices. Our experience was becoming a cautionary tale that helped other families recognize and resist similar manipulation attempts. 1 year after Earl's passing, Sarah and I hosted a celebration on the farm that brought together everyone who had helped us navigate the crisis that had initially threatened to destroy our family's legacy. Helen and her advisors came up from Florida, Dorothy from the county brought her husband and children, and Robert Kim's law firm sent a team that had become genuine friends rather than just professional consultants. We set up tables under the oak tree where Earl was laid to rest, and as the sun set over fields that now generated more income in a month than we'd previously made in a year, I realized that my husband's greatest gift hadn't been the mineral rights he'd protected, but the wisdom he'd shown in choosing people who would honor his memory and continue his work. Sarah had blossomed in the months since her divorce, discovering strength and independence that her marriage had somehow suppressed. The energy company's operations hummed quietly in the background, a reminder that prosperity and stewardship could coexist when managed by people who understood that wealth was meaningless without the relationships and values that gave it purpose. As I watched our guests celebrating under the stars Earl had studied during his final months, I understood that some treasures can't be taken because they're rooted too deeply in love and commitment to be moved by greed or manipulation. The second year brought new challenges and opportunities that tested everything we'd learned about managing sudden wealth responsibly. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell our story as part of a series about mineral rights and family farms, and after careful consideration, Sarah and I agreed to participate if the project would help other rural families recognize and protect their own property rights. The filming process took 6 months and required us to relive the emotional trauma of Marcus's betrayal, but it also provided a platform for discussing the broader issues of corporate exploitation and family manipulation that plague rural communities across America. The documentary premiered at regional film festivals and was eventually picked up by a streaming service, bringing our story to audiences who understood the cultural and economic pressures facing family farms in the 21st century. More importantly, it connected us with other families who had faced similar situations and created a network of mutual support that extended far beyond our county boundaries. Earl would have appreciated knowing that our experience was helping other people protect what their ancestors had built through generations of hard work and sacrifice. The film's success led to speaking engagements where I could share practical advice about protecting property rights and recognizing manipulation tactics. The energy company's production exceeded all projections during the third year, generating royalty payments that allowed us to expand our charitable giving while maintaining the farm's traditional operations. Sarah established a foundation focused on rural education and agricultural sustainability, while I worked with the County Extension Service to create demonstration programs showing how traditional farming could coexist with responsible energy development. We purchased 3 neighboring farms that came up for sale, not for development, but for conservation, creating a protected corridor that ensured wildlife habitat and watershed protection for the entire region. The drilling operations on our property had actually improved soil conditions in some areas by providing better drainage and access to previously unusable sections of the farm, and we were able to increase crop yields while maintaining environmental standards that exceeded state requirements. Local universities began using our property as a research site for sustainable development practices, and graduate students regularly visited to study the integration of energy extraction with agricultural production. The farm that Marcus had seen as a commodity to be liquidated had become a model for balancing economic development with environmental stewardship. Our success story was proving that rural families didn't have to choose between prosperity and preservation. By the 4th year, Sarah had met someone new, a fellow counselor named David, who understood the complexities of our situation and respected the healing process she'd undergone since her divorce. Their relationship developed slowly, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than the manipulation and deception that had characterized her marriage to Marcus. David grew up on a farm in Iowa and brought his own understanding of rural values and family land traditions to our expanding household. Unlike Marcus, who had seen the farm as an obstacle to Sarah's happiness, David appreciated the connection to place and tradition that made our property special beyond its monetary value. When they announced their engagement during harvest season, the celebration felt like a natural continuation of the healing process that had begun when we first discovered Earl's hidden provisions in the original deed. Sarah's wedding would take place under the same oak tree where we'd laid her father to rest, symbolizing the continuity of family values that no amount of wealth could replace. Earl's journal had mentioned hoping that someday the farm would ring with children's laughter again, and I could see that dream becoming reality as Sarah and David planned their future together. The cycle of family life was continuing, strengthened rather than weakened by our trials. The 5th anniversary of Earl's passing marked not just personal healing, but community transformation that extended far beyond our property boundaries. The success of our mineral rights development had attracted other energy companies to the region, but the legal framework Robert Kim had established for our operations became the model for environmental protection that other landowners demanded from corporate partners. Our insistence on sustainable practices and community benefit sharing had raised standards across the county, ensuring that rural families received fair compensation for their resources while maintaining the agricultural character that defined our regional identity. The scholarship fund we'd established had grown large enough to guarantee college funding for every graduating senior in the county who wanted to pursue higher education, and many of those students were returning after college to build careers that combined their urban education with rural values. Sarah's foundation had funded everything from upgraded school technology to community gardens that supplied fresh produce for local food banks. The wealth that Earl had protected from Marcus's manipulation was flowing back into the community in ways that honored both traditional values and modern opportunities for growth and development. We'd proven that prosperity didn't have to come at the expense of community character. As I write this story today, sitting on the same porch where Marcus first presented his deceptive offer to buy our farm, I'm surrounded by evidence of how dramatically our lives have changed while remaining rooted in the same values that Earl and I shared throughout our marriage. The energy company's operations continue to generate income that exceeds our wildest dreams, but more importantly, they've provided security that allows us to make choices based on principles rather than financial pressure. Sarah and David's twins are learning to walk in the same garden where their mother took her first steps, and their laughter echoes across fields that will belong to their family for generations to come. The mineral rights that Marcus tried to manipulate us into giving up have become the foundation for a legacy of community service and environmental stewardship that extends far beyond our property lines. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd signed his papers that first morning, trusting his claims about my financial vulnerability rather than investigating Earl's cryptic references to hidden provisions in the deed. The thought still makes me shudder, not because of the money we would have lost, but because of the family traditions and community connections that would have been destroyed by his greed and manipulation. Earl's wisdom in protecting our land rights saved more than just our financial future. It preserved the values and relationships that make wealth meaningful. The original deed now hangs framed in our kitchen, next to a photograph of Earl taken during our first year on the farm when we were young and optimistic about building something lasting together. Visitors often ask about the connection between the faded document and the modern prosperity evident throughout our property, and I always tell them that the real treasure wasn't the minerals beneath our land, but Earl's wisdom in understanding that some things are too valuable to sell to the highest bidder. The farm that feeds our family and supports our community represents more than property or profit. It embodies the principle that true wealth comes from relationships built on honesty and commitment, rather than transactions motivated by greed and deception. Marcus's betrayal taught us that family loyalty can't be assumed, but must be earned through consistent actions that honor shared values. The deed provisions that Earl protected so carefully were ultimately less important than the love and trust that motivated his protective instincts. If you've ever faced pressure to make major financial decisions during times of grief or uncertainty, remember that the best choices usually require time, research, and advice from people whose interests align with your own long-term well-being rather than their immediate profit. Trust your instincts, protect what matters most, and never let anyone pressure you into decisions that don't feel right in your heart.